afternoon, colleagues. I'm really happy to welcome you to the side event Aligning Export Finance with the Paris Agreement, High Time to Phase Out Fossil Fuels. This is an event that is co-hosted by 5 institutions, and I'm really proud that for the first time in the climate negotiations, the 3 higher education institutions of Zurich in Switzerland have joined their forces, which are the University of Zurich, the ETH Zurich, and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. So I hope that will be a good start of a long-term collaboration on such side events. And we are also happy to be joined by the other observer organizations, Abibimman Foundation and both ends. So it's a good collaboration between researchers and observer NGOs. So this event will look into a topic that is quite hotly debated these days. So we have here the wrong presentation. So let me just continue. We are not talking about net zero commitments, but we are talking about export credit agencies. So export credit agencies are institutions that have the purpose to actually support the activities of the businesses in other countries around the world. So their purpose is essentially to make their companies more competitive than those companies of other countries that produce the same products. So they, of course, are operating in a very competitive environment, and this is an environment that often runs, of course, against climate change targets. So what we did when we were looking at this topic together with both ends about 2 years ago, we were really startled by the fact that these export credit agencies are kind of a white sheet. Nobody talks about those, but they are really highly problematic in a sense that their financing, which is insurance or guarantees for activities that are seen as too risky for the private financiers, that this is very often geared towards traditional fossil fuel technologies. And now I see the right slides. Thank you very much. So this here shows the program of today. So we will start with a video introduction from Friends of the Earth US. Unfortunately, Kate can't be with us today. It will then be followed by Bjarne Steffen, whom you see here on my right-hand side from ETH Zurich. Then my colleague Laila Darouich from Perspectives Climate Research will present about the Paris alignment of export credit agencies, how a general methodology can be developed to actually assess the outcomes of the activities of the export credit agencies. Then we will have Ayumi Fukakusa from Friends of the Earth Japan, who will give her views and, of course, Friends of the Earth views on the activities of the Japanese Export Credit Agency. Then I'm really happy to also have an African representation here from the Alliance for Empowering Rural Communities, a multi-country cases of activities of export credit agencies on the ground in Africa. Then we will have another online participation, a testimony from the ground from Mozambique. This will be given in Portuguese and translated into English about large projects in Mozambique that have been financed through export credits and that have really challenging impacts on the local population. And then we are really happy that we have Marianne Sondergaard Jensen from the Export Credit Fund of Denmark, who will talk about Paris alignment of her institution. And I'm really happy that we don't just have to show bad cases, but that we can also show positive cases. And afterwards, we will be available for discussion with you. So just to now set the scene more carefully, sorry, this is a bit lacking reactivity. So why is this topic so important? Under Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement, we have this transformation of the financial sector, shifting the trillions. And of course, this means private sector will only follow the public sector, and therefore we need a really important role of the public finance institutions to show the path. And as I mentioned earlier, the export credit agencies actually are not really showing the path. I have already been describing a bit about those. What should be relevant for you is that out of the 100 billion goal of OECD for the public for international climate finance, the export credit agencies are only responsible for 3.3%. So a lot of stuff going to fossil fuel, only very limited stuff going to the technologies of the future. And here you just see a few interesting headlines, and actually this morning another headline came because we saw the announcement by the UK and the US and 18 other countries to actually phase out oil and gas financing for the period after 2022. And of course, the other 17 countries, they are not very famous financiers, but UK and US, of course, are heavyweights. And here you see OECD has talked about this. The G20 summit and the weekend has stated something about abolishing export finance for coal plants and so on. So in the last 6 months, we've seen really a flurry of activities pushing into the right direction here. So with that, I would now like to pass on to the video presentation of Kate DeAngelis. Kate, the virtual floor is yours.
We are communicating in different ways, faster ways. Change inspires opportunity. Opportunity moves us to be better.
Last week, looking at G20 countries and their support for overseas energy projects. So export credit agencies, when compared to development finance institutions and multilateral development banks, provide the largest support of fossil fuels. So all of these institutions are not great. They're all providing a lot of support for oil and gas and coal, as you can see in this graph. But export credit agencies provide way more than these other institutions. So multilateral development banks provide about $6 billion per year for fossil fuels, which is about double what they provide for renewables. Development finance institutions provide about $6 billion annually, which is about twice what they provide for renewables. And export credit agencies provide about $40 billion a year for fossil fuels, which is 12 times as much as they provide for renewables. So unfortunately, ECAs are continuing to provide billions of dollars for fossil fuels, and this has been the case since about 2012 that we've been tracking this data. Here, this chart shows the 12 largest supporters of fossil fuels from export credit agencies, with Canada being in the lead. And if you look at this support, You can see fossil fuels are the vast majority in black there. Green is just a teeny strip, which is renewables. And then blue is other, which is transmission, distribution, and other forms of help for the energy sector. So unfortunately, international arena, which are trying to address this form of support, including the OECD Export Credit Group, have failed to address coal, let alone even oil and gas. So recently, the OECD Export Credit Group has been negotiating improvements to their current restrictions on financing for coal plants. Unfortunately, they did not even roll out all support for coal plants. So they can still provide support to coal plants, as some coal plants, as well as coal mines, coal-related infrastructure. And this is definitely an issue because we're seeing countries, including Japan and Korea, supporting coal plants like Nissan 2 and Vanfong 1 in Vietnam. And we're seeing other countries like the US continuing to provide support for coal projects. So unfortunately, national and international policies aren't really restricting this type of support from export credit agencies, and greater restrictions are needed. So if you can see here, the vast majority is red. So we have coal, oil, and gas exclusions in the different columns. The red and orange indicate, or the yellow and orange indicate some form of restrictions, but still not enough. And then the green means that it's almost all excluded or fully excluded from support from those export credit agencies. So in this group of countries, it's similar. Only the UK has restricted oil and gas support. And we would love to see other countries follow in the footsteps of the UK in ending support for export credit support for oil and gas as well as coal. So the recommendations for export credit agencies: 1, immediately end new public finance for oil, gas, and coal projects. Number 2, we need to see greater engagement in diplomacy, whether that's at the OECD or other international fora. There needs to be more restrictions placed internationally for fossil fuels. If we don't see export credit agencies taking this type of making this progress, we're certainly not going to see that in the private sector. And finally, we need to improve transparent and timely reporting on all energy and, frankly, all financing in general. Because if we don't see, if we don't have that greater transparency and disclosure, we're not going to know what forms of projects, what types of projects export credit agencies are supporting, and then it becomes very unlikely that we're going to be able to restrict that financing. So thank you so much for allowing me to present today. I really appreciate it.
So thanks for the virtual presentation from Kate. And without further ado, I would like to pass on to Bjarne. You have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. So welcome, everybody. The motivation for my talk is that ECAs, they are historically not exactly the vanguard of climate alignment. They are laggards. I think Kate just showed that impressively. And so one question is whether one could learn something from how other organizations decarbonized, MDBs, multilateral development banks being one example. And at ETH, for quite some time, we track how MDBs choose high carbon versus low carbon investments in power generation. And we witnessed the shift there from fossil fuel-based plants to renewables. Okay. That is good news because MDBs, they are quite important for emission pathways of developing countries, particularly by financing long-lived power plants. In the decade before the Paris Agreement, we estimate that MDBs were involved in estimated capacity additions of almost 120 gigawatts. For instance, more than 80% of all fossil fuel-based plants in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's fortunate that MDBs greened their portfolio, at least in power generation to a certain extent. And the question is whether this journey of MDBs could be a blueprint for export finance decarbonization. I present a study that links the decarbonization of MDBs to their bank internal policies. And I think it will show that while MDBs are certainly not a perfect blueprint, there are some learnings from their journey for ECAs. Starting with the outcome for power generation commitments at MDBs, we saw that until the Paris Agreement, there was already quite some growth in the share of renewables in power generation commitments, from around 40% to around 70%, which was partly achieved by increased lending for renewables and partly by a reduction of fossil fuel finance, especially for coal-financed power plants. Since the Paris Agreement then, this trend continued with almost 85% of a new finance commitment for power generation being dedicated to renewables over the last 5 years. What is also visible in these numbers, though, is that renewable finance that did grow, but not to the extent that fossil fuel finance was phased out. So there's in some a reduction in power generation finance, and that could be an issue for reaching development goals, SDG 7 especially, but also from a climate perspective. If MDBs phasing out finance for these power plants just means other financiers are stepping in. There are quite some differences between banks and their patterns of decarbonizations. That's what helped us to identify the impact of bank internal policies that I'm going to present. But I don't want to go into details here for these bank differences in the interest of time. So how did MDBs achieve this change in technology portfolios? For that, we analyzed which bank internal policies have been put in place to that end, going through hundreds of documents, policy documents, and via interviews with the staff of all the relevant banks. And we found a lot of policies. That's the numbers on the right. So that's the numbers of policies at the different banks over the last 20 years that have been in place. And on the left-hand side, you see the different policy instruments that we identified. So there's measures with respect to strategy, like normative frameworks and quantifiable goals, often related to the carbon intensity of portfolios. Then there's budget things like new dedicated fund for renewables. There's, of course, tweaks to the lending policy, like operational policies and safeguards, but also changing the economic assessment of project to have a carbon-sensitive economic assessment, and explicit exclusion criteria forbidding certain technologies, such as coal-fired power plants. Then there's organizational measures, internal processes, and information and capacity building policies. From the interviews with those that are affected by such policies in the banks, we saw a quite consistent picture that 4 instruments have been particularly relevant for changing portfolios. And that is quantifiable goals, new dedicated funds, and then on the lending policy side, carbon-sensitive economic assessments and exclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria with some limitations, I would say, because what interviewers there typically said, yes, they are important because they somehow put into law and fix forever that we can't finance certain technologies. But empirically, actually, at the point in time when these policies have been enacted, the inclusion criteria, that was already when we wouldn't bring much forward those projects anyway. So that's kind of at the end of the policy journey only. If we zoom into these 4 most relevant policies, we see how they develop over time. That's for the individual banks here, which clearly shows that the policy actions started quite some time ago, so much earlier than the Paris Agreement in the early 2000s for many banks, especially implementing quantifiable goals on carbon intensity for portfolios and establishing new dedicated fund. The Paris Agreement then gave another boost to the policy density. That's what you see here, so the mere number of policies in 2015, especially at World Bank Group, EIB, and EBRD. The exclusion criteria, that's the green one on the bottom, they came to the game quite late at the World Bank Group and EIB, and then in the very recent years also at other banks. So the very final step of the analysis is then to link these policies to the outcomes that we observe in the commitments that the banks made to high carbon and low carbon technologies. And there we use statistical methods to see to which extent the different policies can explain the commitment outcomes we see. That's regression analysis on the project level. I don't want to go into detail of the method here, but highlight 3 results. The first is a large time effect after 2015. So even after correcting for a number of other factors, we see that projects after 2015, they are 30% more likely to be green. So there seems to be quite an effect of the Paris Agreement, or at least of this time, 2015, 2016, when it came in place. The second is that when correcting for the time effect, we still see that a higher policy density, so generally having more policy, increases the chance of projects being green. And if we look into individual policy instruments, we see in the data, and that's in line with the interviews then, that particularly new dedicated funds for renewables and quantifiable goals seem to make a difference. So that's all for MDBs. That's all nice for MDB. What could be learning for ECAs? I want to highlight 3 points from my point of view. The first is that we think MDBs really show that a stringent policy mix is important. The MDBs, they decarbonized their power generation portfolio by having a lot of policies, different policy, a broad tool set, which included, but was by no means limited to exclusion criteria. Especially the exclusion criteria, they typically only covered coal-fired power plants, and they came very late in the process. So I'm not saying that exclusion criteria, they are not important, but they shouldn't be all that we think about. The second is then, okay, what about other policy instruments? For MDBs, we saw that specifically quantifiable goals on carbon intensity and new dedicated funds were particularly important. The new funds, they allowed to build competencies, relationships on renewables, which actually allowed them to offer alternatives also to the high carbon projects for low carbon finance. And the quantifiable goals, they were in many cases linked to personal incentives in the bank, especially for regional managers, which then put a lot of attention and huge effects on different levels of the organization on the projects. And finally, that's also what we see from the MDB. Besides phasing out fossil fuel finance, also phasing in green finance should be priority. At the MDB, that green finance grew a lot, but not to the extent, at least in power generation, that the fossil fuel-based power generation finance reduced. And if that is the case, also in export finance, I would argue that just the high carbon finance is phased out and not dedicated steps are taken to increase the green side of things, then there's a danger of other financiers stepping in, and also that's a danger or a challenge, at least, to development pathways of countries with a growing need in energy. With that, thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Bjarne. I would like to pass on to Laila. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'm happy to present the results of about 1.5 years of research that my colleagues at Perspectives Climate Research and I did. I mean, in the beginning, it was, as my colleagues here before said, export credit agencies were not on the top of our head when we thought about public finance and their impact on the climate. But after seeing the statistics and the numbers and seeing how hugely important they are in financial terms, we developed a methodology to assess the Paris alignment of export credit agencies. And why did we do it? Because basically we had numerous reasons to say, why is this important? First, there are public finance institutions, so it's public money, which is used with taxpayers' money to finance projects abroad. And these projects and this money should be aligned with the commitments that a country does under the Paris Agreement. And as we saw, fossil fuel investments are definitely not in line with what we want to achieve with the Paris Agreement. So when we developed this methodology, we evaluate the ECA, but also, of course, the government, and which places the policies for the ECAs. And this methodology is based off 5 dimensions. And we have, in these 5 dimensions, we have 18 key questions where we evaluate the ECA. And these are underlying by benchmarks, under which we evaluate the performance. And so by this approach, we can have a transparent approach to see, and we can compare it across countries. We built this approach by looking at former work, which was done for Paris alignment assessment for financial institutions, which is building on the Paris Alignment Working Group at the MDB level, and also the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker metrics, which was really helpful in the development and the work. And our benchmarks are in line with the latest IEA net zero pathway, the IPCC P1 scenario, and we put a big emphasis on the special responsibility of public finance to be a role model for private finance. What is the difference between our methodology to other Paris alignment assessments? Well, in our methodologies, we weight the different assessment dimensions. So, for example, we look at mitigation as well as climate finance, but definitely we see that mitigation and the phase out, for example, of fossil fuels is for us way more important, and that's what we want to see, because we can't outweigh by putting more money into green the continuation of financing fossil fuels. So we definitely put an emphasis on the mitigation and the phase out of fossil fuels, and the lower emphasis on climate finance or overall engagement of the entity in a way for communicating its strategies. Our methodology is based on evidence-based expert judgments. We had multiple workshops with relevant entities discussing our benchmarks and our approaches to get a clear understanding of what are the expert opinions, and on basis of these discussions we built our methodology. And we want to have policy-oriented results, so we want to give clear recommendations to governments and ECAs to improve the performance of their entity. As I said before, the reproducibility of the results and the full transparency are very important for us. Therefore, our methodology is available online. Everyone can apply this methodology to a ECA of the country of their choice. And where we want to go with that is we want to see policy dialogues with the governments and the relevant ministries to drive reforms on the supranational, but also on the national level. So the OECD arrangement update that we saw last week is a great step. It's the first way to see that there is movement in this direction. And also the Export Finance for Future initiative launched last year is a really good step in the right direction. And we want to put the public attention on the focus on export credit agencies and their climate impact. So because MDBs have been under public scrutiny, but export credit agencies have not. And so with our methodology, we want to have a stepping stone into discussions about the Paris alignment of export credit agencies and how this can be achieved. And with our recommendations, we want to give the base for the ECAs and their governments to exchange knowledge between countries and experiences on how to improve. So in the end, we plan to have assessments of all G20 countries. And in the best case, we imagine that these countries will look at our metrics and compare how they performed, and the best practice example and the leaders will show their colleagues how they achieved their target and how they achieved this great result, and help their colleagues to do the same. So now a bit of more the core structure of the methodology. So as I said, we have a weighting approach, which you can see in the second column. And as I said also before, mitigation is for us the key feature. So we have the fossil fuel exclusion policies are weighted the highest, next to transparency, which is also very, very important, because without knowing what is happening on the ground, which kind of activities are supported by the ECAs, we can't assess the rest of the dimensions. So basically, the condition for an assessment, a good assessment result, is transparent disclosure of financial and non-financial data. So then we also have the climate impact, which is more looking into the GHG emissions, if they can be assessed, which is not possible for most ECAs. For now, we really want to see that changed. Then climate finance, their contribution to in various channels, and if they have climate incentives in place. And also the engagement, as I said before, having engaging on the OECD level, engaging in initiatives like the export finance for future initiatives is something we rated in dimension 5. In the end, we had 4 categories for the assessment outcomes, which are unaligned, seen in red, then some progress, Paris-aligned, and transformational. Transformational is really our best category over Paris-aligned, which is already very good. But we wanted to show with this category that there can be the real leaders and the ones which make a transformational change in their business activities. And we wanted to include that to give an incentive to institutions to really aim for the highest ambition. Here you can see an example of one of our key questions and the benchmarks underlying. As I said, we have 72 benchmarks in total. As you can see here, we have in dimension 2 for the phase out of fossil fuels, the coal question. So how ambitious is the ECA with regards to their exclusion? And we look into different dimensions. And we aim to see for Paris aligned that the policy allows no fossil fuels and also none of their related value chains. So after our methodology, we applied obviously this methodology to 3 countries for now. We plan to have the UK and Canada next. And these countries that you can see here, the Netherlands, Germany, and Japan, have been for now our results. And you can see from the top to the bottom the best rating and the worst rating so far. So the Netherlands, they lead, and they're almost at some progress, which is from 0.5 onwards. And they get this good rating because of they have a fossil fuel measurement methodology and a green label methodology with whom you can assess their portfolio better. But as a minus point, we saw that they don't have really concrete policies to phase out. And as I said before, this is a really high-weighted point of our methodology, so that was negatively mentioned. For Germany, we see, well, there are phase-out policies for coal and also some partial for oil, but they are not holistic. And we rather rated the positive for this ECA was the engagement in supranational forums and initiatives, and they also developing a climate strategy, which we rated positively. But the lacking transparency that we saw in this ECA was one of the reasons why it rated so badly, because we couldn't really see what is happening on the ground, what are the GHG emissions, and the fossil fuel phase-out policies, as I said, were rather cherry-picking. Yeah. Then our last candidate was Japan. So Japan was rated the worst. We didn't see much progress from this ECA in this country. It was very hard to find data overall. So positively, we saw that there is a kind of an incentive structure for green businesses. Japan, one has to mention, has 2 ECAs, NECI and JBIC. And we saw that incentive structures are getting in place in both, but more for NECI. But the lacking transparency and the active promotion of fossil fuels is something that led us to the point that we said there's no real progress. Japan can be seen as the main laggard among the G7 countries, and we really need to have a lot of increasing ambition here to have a change. Our general recommendations, I now have to be quick, definitely, as Kate also said before, so transparent disclosure of both financial and non-financial information is crucial. So we need to see the volumes for fossil fuel projects, and we also need to see the GHG emissions. We want to have a phase out of all fossil fuel value chains and no cherry picking between the fossil fuels. So natural gas is not a better solution than coal or oil. And for the transparency part, we need obviously to have the GHG emissions calculated. And then we also want to see GHG reduction targets for the relevant sectors, which are in line with the 1.5 degree target. And obviously, we also wanted for our fourth dimension to have climate finance boost in scale, but also in quality. So climate rewards, like having, for example, better conditions for renewable projects or worse conditions for fossil fuel, is something we want to see. And an engagement and coalitions of the willing to raise ambition, showing that there is a way and that countries can get together and work on a way to build a playing field for ECAs where there's no one left behind. Internationally, obviously, the OECD arrangement is a really important policy framework, and there one could do a fundamentally reform this arrangement. There's a lot to be done, and here one can engage, and we really want to see that for Paris alignment of ECAs. And also engaging with non-OECD countries and the ECAs like China is really crucial to make a difference. With that, I want to close, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Laila. With that, I would like now to pass to Ayumi regarding the Japanese case.
Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Ayumi Fukakusa. I'm climate change and energy campaigner for FOE Japan. And I'm not surprised at the result that just Laila explained earlier, that our ECA rated the worst, and I would like to talk our ECA's case today. So Kate also mentioned their study that Japan is one of the largest financier for fossil fuel projects. And if we count finance since 2012, Japan is the second largest public financier for fossil fuel projects. And when we talk about coal, in terms of coal, Japanese government made little or very slow progress on phasing out coal. And for overseas financing, since 2016, after Paris Agreement adopted, Japanese ECAs supported 9 new coal power plant projects, which are almost 10,000 megawatt in total in capacity. And most of the projects are in Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia or Vietnam. And most of the projects are problematic in terms of human rights violations on the ground, or lack of consultation with communities, or loss of livelihood of communities around the projects. And OECD restricted financing for a specific type of coal projects, but that wasn't enough to stop Japan from financing even less efficient coal power projects. And in 2020, Japanese government announced phasing out public finance support for coal power exports, and G7 also committed the same this year. However, there are 2 projects still in the pipeline of JICA. JICA is not ECA, but they are public entities and development aid agency of Japan. 2 projects are in Indonesia and in Bangladesh. And phasing out coal gets momentum, and today COP presidency announced a new statement, and over 40 countries joined the presidency's call to phase out coal domestically. And Japan is still sadly clinging to coal. And one latest example is that the discussion on the definition of unabated coal. Now, I assume many of us you think unabated coal means coal power plants without CCS. But the Japanese government tries to make the meaning of unabated coal vague, and they insisted in the press conference earlier this week as well, that the definition of unabated is still contested. The reason behind it, we think, is clearly stated in the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's speech the day before yesterday at the World Leaders Summit. And Japanese government pushes co-firing coal with ammonia or hydrogen, and they pledged to help developing countries with these technologies. And most of ammonia and hydrogen are made by fossil fuel, so they are obviously no solution to climate crisis. But and it just seems to the ammonia is for prolonging the existing life of coal power plants. So in summary, I echo what Kate said in her presentation, that the international norms or standards or regulations like OECD set is somewhat help to decarbonize ECAs, but they must close loopholes and they must strengthen their policies. And for Japanese ECAs, there are lack of political will inside Japanese government. And since ECAs are public entities, we must also work on to change political narrative of Japanese government and their policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ayumi, for being very specific. And now we pass on the ground in Africa. So, Richard, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm presenting a story of the local impacts of ECA working in 4 different countries. That's Ghana, Togo, Uganda, and Nigeria. And to start off, Africa has been impacted by climate change and is most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's a continent that has the smallest carbon footprint, yet bearing the enormous carbon footprint impacts on the continent. Now, from the research, we realized that from 2016 to 2018, G20 government-backed ECAs provided $40.1 billion annually to support fossil fuel projects, compared to $2.9 billion investment for clean energy. And it is interesting that ECAs were the worst of the public finance offenders, providing more support to fossil fuels than development finance institutions and multilateral development banks all combined. Now, from this chart, we see a whopping 52% of the investments that ECAs have provided in these 4 countries that we researched on. A huge amount of the investments going to oil and gas sector, with 45% of the investments they made going into large hydro projects. And it's surprisingly that only 1% of the investments of export credit agencies went into clean energy. And since 2015, ECAs have supported oil and gas sector in these 4 countries with an amount of $5.6 billion and large hydro projects with an amount of $5.3 billion. Now, this indicates a list of ECAs that have been working in Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, and Uganda. And we find the amounts that they have heavily invested in oil and gas sector compared to clean energy, which is very, very less. And these investments in the fossil sector have impacted a lot of communities where these projects are located. So for instance, in my country, Ghana, we have witnessed a lot of seaweeds along the coastlines of communities where we have the offshore Cape 3 Points project, which was financed by UKEF from the UK. And we see how the drilling has washed off seaweeds to the coast. And yesterday in the news, the board chairman of the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, Mr. Freddie Blay, visited some of these communities and witnessed for himself the devastation that these fossil projects have caused. And he called for oil companies to come to the aid of communities because they have been impacted. People have lost their livelihoods. There's a lot of environmental destruction. And this narrative is not different when you go to Uganda. We've seen over 7,000 people displaced as a result of the construction of the Kabale International Airport project, which was financed by the Chinese Exim Bank and the UK Export Credit Finance. And another 4,600 people have also been displaced in Uganda as part of the preparation for the ECOP project. And when you go to Nigeria, the story is not different. We see a lot of gas flaring that has polluted the air and has affected human health as a result of the LNG gas plant. The same story is also found in Ghana, where there's a lot of gas flaring from the oil fields that we have in our country. And then the story goes on and on for other projects in other countries. So when you look at the large hydro dams that have been financed by export credit agencies in the 4 countries that we researched in, one of the things that we identified as a huge challenge was lack of proper information provided to the affected communities. And this has led to a lot of social protests and unrest in communities that have been affected. And a clear example in Uganda is the Karuma Hydro Power Station project that has witnessed community members protesting against the project contractors due to displacement, lack of compensation for women farmers who have lost their lands and their livelihoods. With the construction of the Isimba hydroelectric power, we've seen an end to people's income because the area is well known for its tourism potential, and a lot of people visit there, and these communities earn their livelihoods from the tourism. And this large hydroelectric power project has affected their livelihoods. And in Nigeria, there's the construction of the Mabila hydroelectric power station, which is a new project. And it's feared that such a project will displace over 100,000 people from examples that they have had in the country. And these projects have impacted the communities. People have lost their livelihoods. People have been displaced. And it calls for the need for us to shift to renewable energy. And these 4 countries have enormous renewable energy potential, which has not been focused on or highlighted on. And in my country, Ghana, we have a policy, the Renewable Energy Act, which has identified the opportunity to scale up renewable energy to 10% in our energy mix by 2030. When you go to Nigeria, they have a target of 16% renewable energy penetration in their energy mix by 2030. And the narrative is also for Uganda, is the same narrative for them, having a vision of having a clean energy to a tune of 40,000 megawatts by 2040. And this provides an avenue for a just energy transition where ECAs would have to stop financing fossil fuel projects and transition to green, clean energy projects. And so I have this climate clock here with me that is indicating the deadline we have to act in time to ensure that we achieve the 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement, and also the ability to track the renewable energy that are in the world to ensure that we are able to have a solution pathway to reach a net zero emissions. So in conclusion, ECAs working within these 4 countries have provided a tune of $18 billion between the period of 2013 to 2020. And South Korea was the biggest supporter of oil and gas projects in the 4 countries that were studied, providing an insured value of $3.4 billion. European ECAs were not left out because they have also supported fossil fuel projects in these 4 countries. And as I mentioned earlier, the impacts ranges from socioeconomic to gender impacts to environmental impacts. And these impacts have been on land grabbing, displacements, loss of livelihoods, and also the pollution of land and water. And a shift to renewable energy is needed in the global south urgently because we have been greatly impacted. There's huge opportunity for clean energy, and therefore there must be the need to end fossil fuel projects. So we are making a few recommendations to ECAs and the developed nations where these ECAs are coming from, that they must ensure that ECA support to all fossil fuel are excluded, and also that of large hydro plants as well. And they must align the foreign trade policies with a 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement target. We are also calling for ECAs to stop projects that benefit multinational corporations over local populations, because it's causing a lot of violation of human rights and also the rights of indigenous people and their cultural values, and it's displacing people, making them lose their livelihoods, lose a lot of income. And we are also calling for a just transition approach to be used when supporting renewable energy projects, because from the statements that have come from the world leaders, we are seeing that advanced nations are calling for a shift and end to fossil fuel by 2022. So when they're investing in clean energy, they must ensure that we have a just transition approach to such investment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to give the opportunity to show the camera of the clock, because I think the clock has not been visible to. So if you can show his clock, that the participants are able to understand what it means. Can you point the camera on his clock? No, it's not possible. Good, then I apologize. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So with that, I would now like to pass on to Julio in Mozambique. I hope that the connection is stable. I see Julio. Julio, you have the floor.
Bom, sim. Prezados companheiros e companheiras, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Chamo-me Julio Bichehe. Estou aqui em representação de todos os jovens moçambicanos e camponeses, que representam 80% toda a população do meu país, Moçambique. Nós estamos preocupados com as questões das mudanças climáticas e cientes de que isto é uma questão que preocupa a todo cidadão a nível mundial. Portanto, espero eu daqui encontrar pessoas que estejam interessados em abraçar esta causa. O meu objetivo central é de poder discutir seriamente em torno das mudanças climáticas e a forma que os países economicamente mais estáveis têm influenciado para que os países pobres abracem o caminho da exploração dos combustíveis fósseis, como a única forma destes acabarem com a sua pobreza. Se calhar vocês já tenham acompanhado que em Moçambique, nos meados de 2012, foi descoberto a maior reserva de gás natural liquefeito a nível da África Austral, que vai ser explorado a partir dos meados de 2023. Mas antes, porém, deixem-me vos apresentar. Meu nome é Julio Bichehe, tenho 33 anos de idade, filho de uma família camponesa, natural de Cabo Delgado, Moçambique. Fiz o meu nível básico e médio em agricultura e agropecuário. agora estou fazendo o meu nível superior em gestão ambiental e recursos naturais na Universidade Católica de Moçambique. Já trabalhei em várias organizações nacionais, locais e internacionais em prol da defesa dos interesses, na defesa dos direitos humanos e da preservação e conservação ambiental. Bom, em 2015, me foi oferecido a oportunidade de trabalhar com os camponeses do distrito de Palma, numa organização local denominada União Provincial de Camponeses. Uma organização que defende os interesses e os direitos econômicos e sociais a partir da base em Cabo Delgado. Esta organização atua em 11 distritos dos 17 distritos da província de Cabo Delgado, com um universo de mais de 9.000 membros, incluindo homens, mulheres e jovens. Voltando para os projetos de gás natural, na minha província natal, que se chamam Moçambique LNG e FLNG Coral Sul, liderados pela multinacional francesa Total e a italiana Eni. Com a chegada desses projetos, os camponeses e as camponesas lhes foi prometido vários benefícios, dentre as quais emprego com bons salários, com maior destaque para os jovens nativos. Com a pressão do governo e a sede insaciável das multinacionais de gás, as comunidades viram-se obrigadas a ter que ceder as suas terras em um espaço de 7.000 hectares para dar lugar à implantação dos projetos. A UPC e outras organizações da sociedade civil em Moçambique tentam trabalhar de forma incansável em defesa das comunidades, para garantir que as famílias afetadas sejam observados os seus direitos. Infelizmente, os projetos não cumpriram as suas promessas de trazer prosperidade às comunidades. O oposto é a realidade. Vou vos dizer. A região de implantação do projeto de gás é alvo de ataque armado perpetuado pelos terroristas desde o dia 24 de março de 2021. De salientar que estes ataques tiveram início em outubro de 2017. E com o andar do tempo, a situação de insegurança foi se agravando. Até o momento, este cenário já provocou mais de 820.000 deslocados e 310 pessoas mortas. 2. O projeto afetou mais de 650 famílias e estas perderam as suas terras de produção agrícola, como também mais de 450 pescadores não poderão ter acesso ao mar onde habitualmente pescavam e terão que percorrer até 15 quilômetros para aceder à zona de pesca, onde antes do projeto percorriam menos de 2 quilômetros. Os camponeses perderam muitas áreas de produção, onde as suas áreas eram até 100 hectares, e o projeto somente irá atribuir 1,5 hectares para cada família afetada. 3. Os cálculos recentes mostram que o governo moçambicano provavelmente vai ganhar muito menos que os projetos de gás que o previsto. Além disso, Moçambique só começará a ganhar depois de 2040, enquanto o mundo está se afastando do gás. Os projetos de gás não vão apenas contra as estruturas de direitos humanos, eles também não se enquadram à meta de 1,5 de graus Celsius do Acordo de Paris. Uma vez operacionais, se todo o gás for tirado, isso resultará na mesma quantidade de emissão de dióxido de carbono que o setor de aviação na Europa por um ano. O gás natural é, por vezes, descrito como um combustível de transição na resposta à crise climática. Esse argumento foi rejeitado pela Agência Internacional de Energia e cientistas do clima. Em total contraste com o apelo à ação urgente, apelo a uma ação urgente, falado pelos chefes de Estado nesta COP, descobrimos que os mesmos governos, por meio de suas agências de crédito à exportação, têm apoiado bancos privados e exportadores a se envolverem nos projetos de gás em Moçambique. Por exemplo, a China, a França, a Itália, a Holanda, África do Sul, Coreia do Sul, Tailândia, Reino Unido e Estados Unidos da América forneceram pelo menos 18 bilhões para ambos os projetos de gás. O governo holandês mesmo relatou em uma análise em 2019 que, passo a citar, o desenvolvimento de recursos renováveis em Moçambique foi prejudicado nas últimas décadas pela dependência do país dos combustíveis fósseis. Terminei a citação. Ao apoiar os projetos...
Oh. Okay. So I speak now?
Yes.
Yes. And perhaps I'll just speak before we put on the presentation, if I may. Because first I would like to thank you very much for inviting me here for this very important and much needed discussion on ECA financing. And perhaps I would like to start by agreeing with many of the things that have been pointed out today, especially that I'm completely in agreement that ECAs have a very important role to play in climate finance. I agree that there's a lot of improvement to do. We need for improve our transparency. There was an issue on increasing diplomatic pressure on some of these elements and discussions, and improving the negotiations on the frameworks. So there is a lot of work for us to do. However, there are three elements also that I heard that I would like to comment on that I may not agree on. And this is to have a bit of a debate. And there are three premises for this whole discussion that I think we have to keep in mind. And one is this comparison with multilateral development banks. You can compare in the sense that, of course, we do the same types of projects, but you can't compare completely. And to simplify, and with the risk of, when you simplify, you also oversimplify. But in some ways, it's like saying you have two construction companies. One is asked to build a beautiful and sustainable house. They can choose the products they want. They can choose they have no restrictions on how to do it. And they can source from wherever they want. And then you have another construction company that says, your goal is to build a house using these tools, these resources, and by the way, we also restrict on what products you can do and how you do it. So my point with that is saying that we have to change the premises of the companies, of the two construction companies, because you can never, if you don't change the premise of the ECA, then it will be difficult to build as beautiful and sustainable a house. And that's where the point of diplomacy, of increasing focus on the need for change is vital, and I completely agree with you on that. The second premise I heard a bit is that ECAs have been laggards, and there I don't completely agree, because if you, perhaps we have been over the past 5 years, but if you look further back, Within that, the restrictions that ECAs have, and those are our governments who give us those restrictions. We actually negotiated the first trade agreement incentivizing climate finance. But it was before you even started talking about climate finance, or we all started talking about it. So maybe we were too early, because it wasn't noticed that we actually improved, because we couldn't restrict what we were allowed to do. We decided, let's try and give better terms for renewable energy. And at least for Denmark, which I will show you, made an incredible difference to our portfolio. If we hadn't done that, we would not have been able to go out and finance as much renewable energy as we've done. We've also seen when we negotiated the common approaches that you have actually an agreement among many ECAs of having the same approach to doing environmental and social due diligence and using international standards. And at that time, many development banks did not use international standards. They did not have the same level of standards, and they did not have a common global agreement. So laggards, I don't agree. Maybe lately we should improve. The third one is that we shouldn't forget the benefit of why we have an ECA and the structure of the arrangement and the rules that we abide by. And that is, for us, it's trade and avoiding unhealthy competition and avoiding a new debt crisis. There are a lot of other elements that to deliver on the climate ambitions, we also need stability, global and financial stability, and there you also need some type of regulation to avoid a credit war, to avoid unsustainable debts, and to improve common standards. Having said that, perhaps now I could put the presentation on, and just to show you the Danish example. And this has been perfect timing. I'm very happy to be able to actually, it was just announced yesterday, so I'm glad that this was the day after, because we have actually just introduced our climate policy, which is a goal of net zero 2045. And this is our way of trying to contribute to the Paris Agreement and our ambitions on climate. But perhaps here what I would like to focus on the 5 initiatives. I think it's very important to remember we could only do this because our government has decided to do this. As a company, EKF could not itself say we refuse. Our mandate was you have to support all, you have to use this toolbox, and you're not allowed to say no to any toolbox, any of the resources in there. It takes the government to say we don't want to support fossil fuels. Denmark has said that. So now EKF can say, okay, we can say no to fossil fuels and phase them out. But so first we need our governments to do that, and we've seen that happening in COP, and the pressure has to continue. But of course what ECAs can do within this are the other elements. And that is how we cooperate with our customers to innovate, to help them innovate their work on reducing emissions, trying to discuss with them or think of ways, new products or new ways of saying, well, you know, do you have any innovation in your portfolio that we perhaps could try and help you export instead of the traditional? We're trying, the second point is that we will now, because of this ambition, also try to look at some of the more innovative sectors, take more risk upon our books and say, this is how we can help innovation in the green technology. We commit, EKF will try to, or will continue leadership in our international negotiations on these issues. We're a member of the E3F. We we're very focused on trying to improve the arrangement and the common approaches. And we also commit to trying to find new solutions, products, and that will actually help and deliver a difference in the financing portfolio. And this is just basically, this is our portfolio today. 70% of our portfolio is green. And I think there again, we can't take the credit for that. That's our companies. We're lucky that our toolbox actually had renewable energy. Others had a bit blacker toolbox to play with. So we're at a very good, it's easier for us to come and say net zero 2045. We may be able to achieve it, but it will take a lot of work. It will also take a lot of work on trying to make sure it's not greenwashing, on the counting, which methodologies, having the same approach, avoiding competition, etc. And I can see the time is running, so I will stop here and let you take some.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne. This was highly relevant to give a kind of mirror against which the preceding presentations would be seen. I understand that we have no specific questions from our virtual audience. That's why I would now like to use the last 5 minutes to give every panelist one sentence. What are, let's say, what have you learned from today's event? Or what would be the message that you would like to give to the audience? I start here from the right-hand side, Bjarne, and then we move down our whole speakers here. Please.
Yeah, I see there's quite some consensus, a joint understanding of the problem at hand and the willingness to do something. And I think in the direction, thanks for your remarks, in the direction of ECA, I would just encourage to also be a bit creative and not just say, okay, we have this straitjacket, we just have this mandate, we can't do anything else. But look at inspirations, can be NDB, can be many other things, to try to see what's possible within the frame and where can we maybe push the frame even a bit more to make even more possible.
Thank you, Bjarne. Laila?
Thank you so much. I think this panel was very good in a way that we saw solution approaches, we saw what is happening on the ground for what are ECA activities doing in Africa, for example, presented by Richard and also by Julio. And we saw also what ECA say, how they see their role in all of this. And definitely one point raised by Marianne, I totally agree. Governments are of immense importance here. And because of that, we want to show with our methodology and with this panel and more increasing visibility of the problem of ECAs and Paris alignment, that we put pressure on governments to make a change, to go more in the direction of phasing out fossil fuels and increasing their share of renewable energies. And if we get the attention of governments and of the civil society, then we can make a change in the future. And I'm really looking forward to the oncoming years with more announcements like this from Denmark of net zero.
Thank you, Laila. Ayumi?
Thank you so much. I think it was Fiona's presentation that he mentioned phase out and phase in. I think we want to see real shift of flow of money, phasing out fossil fuel financing, but the money needs to be spent for the really needed projects. And I also want to mention that the JBIC Japanese ECA just announced a net zero target by 2050, right before the COP26. But we really need to see what really mean by net zero, how they achieve. And the other speakers also mentioned Paris alignment is important, but also project needs to be concern the human rights issues as well. So thank you so much for today's opportunity.
So, as was mentioned, we are happy that countries are calling for cleaner forms of energy, which is phasing out fossil fuels by 2022. We are calling for a just energy approach to investments by ECAs, and that is critical for us because it will secure livelihoods of people and avoid certain impacts that have been outlined as some devastating challenges that communities are facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Marianne?
Well, perhaps just to say that this type of discussion is very important, and we need you to change, to put focus on the need for changing the framework for ECAs. I think just we continue this type of discussions.
Yeah, so I would like to thank the virtual audience. Unfortunately, I can't see you. I hope you're numerous, and I hope you've enjoyed our event. So I would like to thank the panel, which spanned really a very broad set of groups, experts, stakeholders. For me, it was a fascinating experience, also the organization of the event. I hope it won't be the last event on ECAs in the UNFC context. I hope that the next year, the year after, we will be able to show improvements of the ECAs. And of course, I hope that EKF, once the case study is being done, will score green. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a good evening and we will have a successful COP outcome.